This is Peter Helland on the show Israel. I titled the show Beware of the Leaven of Herod, and that is Mark 8:15. I'll read it from the King James and then the ESV. Jesus charged them saying, let's go 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than one loaf. And Jesus charged them, saying, take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and of the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have no bread. And when Jesus knew it, he said unto them, why reason ye because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not yet, neither understand? Have ye your heart yet hardened? Having eyes, see ye not, and having ears, hear ye not, and do ye not remember? And I guess in the ESV it just uses the word yeast. Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. And then he goes on and says, of course they thought he was talking about bread, physical bread, and Jesus is going, why are you talking about having no bread? By now you should understand what I meant. So what does that say? There's a lot of scriptures that we read them like the apostles did. We misunderstand what Jesus is saying. And that's throughout. And when Jesus came, the Jews were reading the Bible literally, and the gospel in the Old Testament was not even slightly literal. In other words, nobody had ever discerned the gospel in the Old Testament. None of the rabbis, there's nothing on record that I know of that even one person, other than Christ, understood the actual message of the Old Testament. They were that blind, and yet it was staring them right in the face. And what is the message? That the Messiah would suffer and that he would rise again on the third day. That's 1 Corinthians 15. That's the gospel. The Messiah would suffer, the Old Testament said, and on the third day he would rise again. The Old Testament said that. That was the message of the whole Old Testament. That's primarily what it was saying. That's what Jesus was basically saying. This is what it's saying. Everything else is leading up to that the Messiah would suffer and rise again on the third day. Not one person saw that message. Now, there's a lot of evidence that they saw the first part. Some rabbis understood that the Messiah would suffer. By the time Jesus came, I don't know if anybody did. But nobody that I know of saw that the Old Testament was constantly saying that the Messiah would rise on the third day. So what does that tell us? That it tells us there's the glory of God to conceal a matter. It says this in Proverbs. And it's the glory of a king to search it out. And when you come to Christ and you're born again by the Holy Spirit, in a way you become a priest and a king. And now you are pursuing truth. That's your mission, is to be led by the Holy Spirit into all truth. And the fundamental truth is that the Messiah would suffer for our sins and on the third day rise again. And not just rise again, but rise to sit on David's throne. That was the whole point of rising, to sit on David's throne, bring in the kingdom, subdue all things. God would subdue all things under Christ's feet, and then when that is done, Christ would then give the kingdom back to God and submit himself unto God himself. That's the whole package. But beware of the leaven of Herod. Beware of false teaching coming in and blinding you to the whole thing. Jesus said, I came so that the blind could see, and that those who see, I came to make them blind. And basically, the blind are the humble, the poor in spirit, and those who claim they see are the proud, the spiritually, especially the spiritually proud. The greatest danger out there is spiritual pride. Why do you think God had to give Paul a thorn in the flesh? Thorn in the Greek is a stake. He had to give him a stake. He had to jam a stake into his flesh. And God didn't do it personally. He said he had a messenger of Satan do it. But God did it. So that Paul would not get spiritually proud. Our tendency to pride is like breathing. We just breathe automatically, and we go to pride automatically. And unless God intervenes and does something, probably most people go to pride. Adam went to pride. And pride and freedom seemed to go together because Adam wanted to be free from God's control. You shall be as gods if you eat that fruit. So the Americans, who we're going to center on, because that's where I am here, America. America is completely unique. There was never something like America before America that I know of. Until America, a nation was an ethnos. That's what the word nation means. The Greek word ethnos means nation. You're French, you're German, you're English, you're Chinese, and you lived like Genesis 10 was commanded. You are to live with your own. Have boundaries and live with your own. And tradition always was, the French married the French. And then on top of that, the Lutheran married the Lutheran. It was kind of rare for a French not to marry a French, and it was kind of rare for a Lutheran not to marry a Lutheran. That's just how it was done. But with America, the whole thing is up for grabs. And the attempt to form this country was met with severe battle, theological battle. And that battle was seen in the Methodist Church, Wesley and his successor, John Fletcher, battling it out with the theologians in England, particularly Bristol and London, Price and Evans, debating the theology. And as I said on the last show with Gus, Wesley and Fletcher, the founders of the Methodist Church, South Bend, I read, has had 48 Methodist churches. So the Methodist Church is by far the biggest church that America has ever had. They're on the downslide, been on the downslide for quite a while. But Wesley and Fletcher said the principles that were laid for the American Revolution were satanic. And let me read that, what they said. This is Fletcher. Wesley wrote mostly pamphlets. Fletcher wrote books, 1775, 1776. This one is by Fletcher, John William Fletcher. American patriotism farther confronted with reason, scripture, and the constitutions. Observations on the dangerous politics taught by Mr. Evans and Dr. Price, with a scriptural plea for the revolted colonies. And just real quickly getting to the core of what he's trying to say in this book. He says, I have dwelt the more upon this part of our controversy because the notion that self-government and self-legislation naturally belong to all men in general, and to the people and colonies of Great Britain in particular, is the phroton pseudos, the Greek words, the capital error, which flows from which flows your American patriotism. And he writes, O King, puts this in the words of somebody. O King, the spirit of domination and the lust of power make thee mad. King George. Thou wilt sheath thy sword in our bowels and spread misery among a happy people for no other end than to oblige them to acknowledge thy supremacy. That's what the American patriots said. You guys just want us to acknowledge that you own these 13 colonies and you are king over us, which he was. We confess that the present contest is for dominion on our side as well as on thine, but with this essential difference. Thou art struggling for dominion over others, we for self-dominion, the noblest of all blessings. That was Evans and Price saying that. And then Fletcher writes, this seditious sophism is sufficient to fill us with a just detestation of Dr. Price's politics. But a scheme which has a direct tendency so to level authority as to subvert all government and abolish all subordination in the universe, such a scheme, I say, cannot be too strongly opposed. It should be totally extirpated. Archimedes said once, give me a point on which I may fix my engine and I will move the earth out of its place. And I may say, give me Dr. Price's political principles, which are exactly the political principles that America was founded on. And I will move all kings out of their thrones and all subjection out of the world. And he explains. Dr. Price's principles were summarized again in this statement. And this is Dr. Price himself. And next book I'm going to move into is Robert Louis Dabney, that he wrote right after the Civil War, because the issue of the Civil War was slavery. And come to find out, the issue of the American Revolution was slavery. It was the general term slavery that drove the American Revolution, and it was the literal slavery of the master-slave relationship that drove the Civil War. But it was nevertheless, both were slavery. Dr. Price says, he writes, Dr. Price has converted me to patriotism. Of course, he's being facetious. I act according to his admired doctrine, which is summed up in the following propositions. Dr. Price, in a free state, every man is his own legislator. To be free is to be guided by one's own will, and to be guided by the will of another is the character of servitude. As far as, in any instance, the operation of any cause comes in to restrain the power of self-government, so far slavery is introduced. Nor do I think that a preciser idea than this of liberty or slavery can be formed. Okay? This is what the whole Civil War, this is what the whole political and theological debate was about. Because these are both theologians. Dr. Price, big theologian, and Dr. Fletcher. I don't know if he was a doctor or not. John William Fletcher, who was the appointed successor of John Wesley. So Price says, as far as, in any instance, the operation of any cause comes in to restrain the power of self-government, so far slavery is introduced. Nor do I think that a preciser idea than this of liberty or slavery can be formed. And of course, Fletcher radically disagreed. And then Fletcher says, well, you know what? This reminds me of John Milton's famous poem, Paradise Lost. And he says, in Paradise Lost, which is a classic, you have Satan debating Jesus. And so here's the exchange. First of all, Fletcher writes, nothing can exceed the wickedness of this patriotic speech of mine about taxes except the insolence of that which follows. Of course, it ended up on tax. Of course, it was money. The colonists were money hungry. There's a lot of political scientists that argued that it was commerce and money and greed that formed the basis of much of the American Revolution. Fletcher writes, I suppose it was made by Satan to the Son of God when, according to Milton's fancy, they encountered each other in the heavenly plains. I meet thee in the field, says the fiend, to defend my freedom and assert the liberty of these heavenly legions. Before I pierce thy side with my spear, let me pierce thy conscience with my arguments. This is Satan talking to Jesus. In a free state, much more in heaven where liberty is perfect. In a free state, everyone is his own legislator. To be free is to be guided by one's own will, and to be guided by the will of another is the character of servitude. They call the Messiah the Prince, but as for much as thou sayest, I do nothing of myself, and art not ashamed to add, Father, not my will, but thine be done, and to teach the mean spirits who follow thee to pray, thy will be done in heaven and on earth. It is plain that thou restrainest the power of self-government and introducest slavery. We hate slavery in this country, right? Yeah. Where's it coming from? Straight from Satan. That's what Fletcher is saying. That's what Dabney is saying. Thou art lost to all sense of heavenly patriotism. Yeah, what's going on in Ukraine? They're fighting for liberty, right? What kind? The Archbishop just gave a big speech at the Notre Dame commencement, totally defending Ukraine and fighting for liberty. The question is it Satan's notion of liberty, or is it Jesus Christ's notion of liberty? It is plain that thou restrainest the power of self-government and introducest slavery. Thou art lost to all sense of heavenly patriotism, enslaved thyself. Thou comest to damp the noble flame of liberty, which glows in these angelic bosoms, and to make us wear the badge of the most abject slavery as thou dost. Thou proud and base tool of tyranny, can thy reason blame us for our noble struggle? If you listen to that Archbishop's talk, the noble struggle for human dignity. Can thy reason blame us for our noble struggle, since we are not allowed to have our natural right of legislating for ourselves? Sounds like Ukraine, doesn't it? And if those dastardly spirits who compose thy host say, neither have most of us, I reply, then you so far want liberty, and your language is, we are not free, why will they be free? I have no other notion of slavery but being bound by a law to which I do not consent. No, that's out of John Milton's Paradise Lost, according to Fletcher. Then we're going to skip around here, but at the end here, Fletcher says, I need not tell you, sir, talking to Dr. Price, that this speech of the patriotic seraph, Satan, is formed upon the principles laid down in Dr. Price's pamphlet. And the principles in Dr. Price's pamphlet are the principles of the American patriots. To return, he says, if your doctrine directly or indirectly strikes at the authority of God and Caesar, as the two preceding speeches show it does, how dangerous is your patriotism? What's the title of the book? Observations on the dangerous politics taught by Mr. Evans and Dr. Price. The politics that formed the basis of the American Revolution. So he closes at this little part. Should you wonder, sir, at my repeated opposition to your principles, I shall urge two things by way of apology for it. Though I believe that you and your second, Dr. Price and Dr. Evans, mean well, yet some of your principles I fear, a tendency to raise or foment a spirit of disobedience, sedition, and anarchy. And as a minister of the Church of England, I have subscribed to the doctrine of the homily against disobedience and willful rebellion, which contains this remarkable ejaculation. This was in the Anglican Methodist Church. God of his infinite mercy grant unto us, this is what all the ministers, all the priests, Anglican priests had to subscribe, put their hand on and subscribe to. God of his infinite mercy grant unto us that we may be good, natural, loving, and obedient subjects, not only showing all obedience ourselves, but as many of us as are able, to the utmost of our power, ability, and understanding, endeavoring to stay and repress all rebels and rebellions against God, our gracious Prince, and natural country, at every occasion that is offered unto us. And that which we are all able to do, unless we do it, we shall be most wicked and most worthy to feel in the end such extreme plagues as God has ever poured upon rebels. I am bound at the occasion offered me by your reply and your quotations to do what I am able to do in order to rectify your mistakes and guard my readers against what appears to me the natural tendencies of your principles. How have we arrived where we're at? Because of the tendency of the principles upon which this experiment was laid, obviously. And until we go to the root of those principles and root them out if they're wrong, and they are wrong, forget it. Just forget it. Now we jump to another great theologian. Some people, the president of Princeton, I think it was Archibald Alexander, I think he said that Robert Louis Dabney was the best theologian in the country. I know it was said. I think he's the one that said it. It was a president of Princeton that I read. Robert Louis Dabney was the best theologian in the country, if not the world. The guy definitely was a theological genius. Now he writes this right after the Civil War. He was, for 6 months, Stonewall Jackson wanted him desperately to be his chief of staff. Now, Stonewall Jackson considered him the best theologian in the country, probably. I never read that he said that he was the greatest. Jackson wouldn't have talked that way. But for 6 months, Jackson had him at his side. And Dabney said, I'm not fit for this job. It's not I'm not physically fit for it. And Jackson said, well, here's all I require. Rise early. Just rise early and be ready for the day. That's all he wanted. So in this Defense of Virginia, written 1865, 1866. So now we're talking about slavery again. But slavery is the issue. And the reason that Dr. Price and Dr. Evans defended the Americans, it was a matter of liberty and slavery. And to have somebody tell you what to do, other than yourself telling you what to do, that's slavery. That's the essence of slavery. Nobody has a right to tell you what to do under their notion of Christian liberty. So Dabney writes in this little section here of the book, the radical objection to the righteousness of slavery in most minds is that it violates the natural liberty and equality of man. To clear this matter, it is our purpose to test the common theory held as to the rights of nature and to show that this ground of opposition to slavery rests upon a radical and disorganizing scheme of human rights, is but Jacobinism in disguise. Now, Jacobinism is the force that drove the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution was in part created by us. Thomas Paine was like one of the main creators of the political philosophy. I mean, he borrowed it, of course, but he popularized it. And when he succeeded, and the Patriots won over Britain, then Paine said, this is for the world. What we just did here, it's the shot that rang around the world, Lexington and Concord. It was to go. So where did Thomas Paine go immediately after he won? To the greatest nation on the earth, according to some, France. And he was going to spread the same teaching into France. And he went there, Thomas Jefferson went there, James Monroe went there. They went there to spread the same thing. And Benjamin Franklin par excellence. And don't forget, Thomas Paine's, Lincoln's favorite author, according to many writers, is Thomas Paine, along with Theodore Parker. Thomas Paine, his next books after the American Revolution were books trying to disprove Christianity, and Lincoln loved it, of course. Is but Jacobinism in disguise and involves a denial of all authority whatsoever. See the parallel? It's the same debate. Okay? Now, people argue that the French Revolution was so different than ours. Yeah, well, you know, let's say you have the Baptist and you have the Pentecostals. On the surface, people think they're so different. One speaks in tongues and one doesn't. One believes in the gifts of the Spirit and one generally doesn't. But they both have borrowed almost extensively from C.I. Scofield. So 90% of their teachings are exactly the same and more. It's just on the surface they look different. So the French Revolution, yeah, it looks like it was different, and it was much further. Yes, it was much further because they went to demolish Christianity completely. But don't forget, that's what Thomas Paine's goal always was. And Lincoln was his man to accomplish it. People don't want to say that. The Republican Party doesn't want to say that, of course. Dabney writes, the popular theory of man's natural rights, of the origin of governments, and of the moral obligation of allegiance is that which traces them to a social contract. The true origin of this theory may be found with Hobbes of Malmesbury. It owes its respectability among Englishmen chiefly to the pious John Locke, a sort of baptized image of that atheistic philosopher. And it was ardently held by the infidel Democrats of the first French Revolution. And don't forget, Lord Acton, the famous Lord Acton, who said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, said the American Civil War was the second French Revolution. He corresponded with Robert E. Lee after the war. According to this scheme of the social contract from Hobbes and Locke, according to this scheme, each person is by nature an independent integer, wholly sui juris. Sui juris means like when you turn 18, you're fully emancipated, so you're fully independent and you're on your own. Absolutely equal to every other man and naturally entitled as a lord of creation to exercise his whole will. Man's natural liberty was accordingly defined as privilege to do whatever he wished. True, Locke attempts to limit this monstrous postulate by defining man's native liberty as privilege to do whatever he wished within the limits of the law of nature. But this virtually returns to the same, because he teaches that man is by nature absolutely independent, so that he must be himself the supreme original judge, what this law of nature is. We're getting right to the core of Americans, which leads to unbelievable pride. According to the doctrine of the social contract, man's natural rights are confounded with this so-called natural liberty. Each man's natural right is to protect his own existence and to possess himself of whatever will render it more happy. And this scheme most essentially ignored the originality of moral distinctions. Hobbes explains them as the conventional results of the rules which man's experience and convenience have dictated to him. For the experience of the mutual violences and collisions of so many independent wills in this supposed state of nature induced men in time to consent to the surrender of a part of this native independence in order to secure the remainder of their rights. To do this, they are supposed to have conferred together and to have formed a compact with each other, binding themselves to each other to submit to certain stipulated rules which restrained a part of their natural liberty and to obey certain men selected to govern. Now, this is pure fantasy and admitted to be fantasy by the legal scholars, as he mentions, Blackstone's commentaries. This is pure fantasies. This is denying the real story of Adam and Eve and coming up with a fairy tale of evolution. It's similar, but they're kind of reversed. But this is what our legal system is founded on: an absolute lie and an absolute fantasy, something that never occurred. But it's advantageous, probably, for the powerful and rich. That's how it usually works. Reading that last sentence again. To do this, they are supposed to have conferred together and to have formed a compact with each other, binding themselves to each other to submit to certain stipulated rules which restrained a part of their natural liberty and to obey certain men selected to govern. The power thus delegated to these hands was to be used to protect the remaining rights of all. The terms of this compact form the organic law or constitution. Our Constitution is based on this. Total lie. Subsequent citizens entering the Commonwealth by birth or immigration are assumed to have given an assent, express or implied, to this compact. And if the question be asked why men are morally bound to obey magistrates, who naturally are their equals and fellows, the answer is this. The answer of this school is because they have voluntarily bargained to do so in entering the social compact, and they receive a quid pro quo for their accession to it. Such is the theory of the origin of government, from which the natural injustice of slavery is deduced. Why is slavery wrong? It violates this fairy tale. You ask somebody, tell me why slavery is wrong. No, Dabney goes into, no, slavery is the master-slave relationship. Marriage. What is marriage? It's the husband-wife relationship. Is marriage evil? Is the husband-wife relationship, is that concept an evil concept that we should consider it evil? A lot of people in this country, after the Civil War and before the Civil War, totally argued that it was evil. And they hooked up with the abolitionists who argued that the slave-master relationship was evil, because they are practically the same. If you're honest. Now, most people are not honest, so it's not going to go anywhere. But if you're honest, the slave-master relationship and the husband-wife relationship are practically the same in its principal elements. Namely, the wife must take her husband's name, and she must make a vow to honor and obey him as unto Christ with the godly fear. The slave is obligated to fear the master and obey him as unto Christ. The wife is obligated to call her husband master. Are there some similarities here? I see similarities. I'd like to know what the differences are. I grant there's differences, but the similarities are overwhelming. Nobody wants to admit any of this. But what happens when you deny reality? You got yourself in trouble. He writes, such is the theory of the origin of government from which the natural injustice of slavery is deduced. For obviously, if man's obligation to civil society originates in the voluntary social contract of independent integers, none can be rightfully held to a compulsory obedience which enters into all servitude, both domestic and political. Some liberal writers, as Blackstone and the great Swiss publicist Berla-Maciu, are too sensible not to see that this scheme is false to the facts of the case. But they still hold that although individual men never in fact existed in the independent insulation supposed, and did not actually pass into a state of society by a formal social contract, Yet such a transaction must be assumed as the implied and virtual source of political power and civic obligation. Now, who paid them off? Obviously, the rich people did pay them off. What else could it be? To us, it appears that if the contracting never appeared in fact, but is only a theoretical fiction, it is no basis for anything, and no source of practical rights and duties. Civil society is a universal fact, and its existence must be grounded in something actual. We object then to this dream of a social contract preceded by a native state of individual independence, that it is false to the facts of the case. Human beings never rightfully existed for one moment in this state, out of which they are supposed to have passed by their own option. God never gave them such independency. Their responsibility to Him and to the civil society under which He has placed them is as native as they are, being ordained by God to exist from the first. Men do not choose civic obligation, but are born to it, just as the child to his filial obligation. And we could go on. So, let's read this part here. It's kind of interesting how Dabney saw this thing coming. This is 1866. I've read a lot from Women's Rights Women, which was 1871. But this was written right after the Civil War. But other consequences follow from the abolitionist dogmas. Quote, all involuntary restraint is a sin against natural rights. That's their dogma. That's what the North was fighting for. The Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was the song to John Brown in the beginning. John Brown went to his neighbors that he believed they held he believed they held pro-slavery views in Kansas. Brought his sons, and he took machetes and cut off their limbs and killed them. Would go to their houses and ask for help and fake them out and then slaughter them, house to house. And the North wrote books praising him for that. Literally, that's true. They wrote books praising him for that. He is now their hero. Then he got 6 of the most wealthy, dominant men in the North to support his attempt to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, capture those guns, and give them to the slaves in the South so that they could escape, kill their masters, and escape. The North just loved this idea. The Republican Party loved this idea. And when the wife of one of the Secret Six, Julie Ward Howe, who's the originator of Mother's Day in America, when she heard at the Battle of Manassas how the soldiers were singing, John Brown's body lies a moldering in his grave, and his soul goes marching on. They were the soul of John Brown. That's what the soldiers saw themselves. We are the soul of John Brown marching on. She said, I can write better words. So she wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Now, she was not a Christian at all. She was a Unitarian. Now, I'm not saying that the South had problems. You know, they had their battle flag was St. Andrew's crucified sideways, and then they called it the rebel flag, and they called themselves rebels. St. Andrew, the first apostle, was not a rebel. Satan was a rebel. So the Southerners were confused. But Dabney was not too confused. But other consequences follow from the abolitionist dogmas. All involuntary restraint is a sin against natural rights. Therefore, laws which give to husbands more power over the persons and property of wives than to wives over husbands are iniquitous and should be abolished. He's quoting from their sources. The same decision must be made upon the exclusion of women, whether married or single, from suffrage, office, and the full franchises of men. See, now this is the Second French Revolution. Karl Marx wrote for the biggest newspaper in America. I don't know if it was weekly or whatever it was, but he wrote all the time. And Horace Greeley hired him to write his articles in the most influential newspaper in America, Karl Marx. He was 100% behind Lincoln winning that war. And after he won it, Marx said, now the revolution can begin. And the Republicans were 100% behind Karl Marx. Maybe not all knowingly, but that's who they fought for. Just like World War II, we fought for Joe Stalin. I guess we didn't think we were, but we were. So Dabney already saw, 1866, that the revolution, they destroyed the slave-master relationship on the idea that it's not, that the slave never gave consent to obey that master, and that immediately would take out marriage because they're both almost the same principles. So the first thing he says, marriage is going to go. There must be an end of the wife's obedience to her husband, he writes. It is said that these subordinations are consistent because women assent to them voluntarily in consenting to become wives. This plea is insufficient because the female sex is impelled to marriage by irresistible laws of their nature and condition. How tyrannous is this legislation which shuts women up to the alternative of foregoing the satisfaction of the prime instincts of her existence, or else of submitting to a code of natural injustice! Exclamation point. As to the disabilities of single women, this plea has no pretended application. Thus the abolitionists will reason, yea, are reasoning. What was the strange prediction of prophetic wisdom a few years ago is now already familiar fact. Female suffrage, the right of women to vote, is already introduced in one state and will doubtless prevail as widely as abolitionism. Surprisingly, it took until about 1920. But he keeps writing, but when God's ordinance of the family is thus uprooted and all the appointed influences of education thus inverted, when America has had a generation of women who were politicians instead of mothers, how fundamental must be the destruction of society, and how distant and difficult must be the remedy. This is where we're at. He saw it in 1866, and now how could you not see it today? How can you not see it? Let's read that again. But when God's ordinance of the family is thus uprooted, and all the appointed influences of education thus inverted, when America has had a generation of women who were politicians instead of mothers, how fundamental must be the destruction of society, and how distant and difficult must be the remedy. Once more, he says, the same principles have consistently led some abolitionists to assail the parental relation itself. For although none can deny that, in helpless infancy, subjection should be the correlative of protection and maintenance, when once the young citizen has passed from the age of childhood, by what reason can the abolitionist justify his compulsory government by the father? Are not all men by nature equal? And then he goes on and says, it has been currently asserted that the premises of the abolitionists were embraced in the Declaration of Independence, so that the United States had been committed to them from the beginning. Yeah, they are true. But John Henry Hopkins, the greatest theologian of the North by a lot, Dabney, both agreed that the Declaration of Independence has nothing to do with anything. Nothing. It has no legal standing, and it was just a political document that didn't necessarily have any biblical truth in it at all. In fact, Hopkins says, this is ridiculous. Read this. It's ridiculous. Oh, but we've made it into idolatry. And from these supposed principles of the Declaration of Independence, slavery is wrong and women shouldn't have to obey their husbands. The Declaration of Independence is a joke. There's no truth in it necessarily at all. Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine, whoever wrote it, just flew it out. Calling King George a tyrant. the two greatest men of the Revolution, John Knox Witherspoon and John Adams, said that King George was absolutely not a tyrant. So that makes the Declaration of Independence a joke. Oh, let's worship it. Let's worship everything it says, which is what we do. And from that, you derive a radically false notion of liberty and slavery. The Bible says, prove all things, test all things. Don't just be... So one thing my mom always said, don't believe everything you read. And I thought, what does she mean? I guess she said that because during the World War II, Time magazine came to Madison, Wisconsin, because Madison was a hotbed. And my mom was chosen to show the Time correspondent around the campus. And so she was with him, that person, all day. And when the article came out, my mom couldn't believe the lies that were written. I think that's from that experience. She told me, don't believe everything you read. Well, I didn't realize that the textbooks they gave me at Notre Dame were going to be lies. I wasn't smart enough to apply my mom's teaching to me. Just like nobody believed that Time magazine was telling lies, I didn't believe those textbooks they gave me were lies. Well, even if I thought they might have been lies, they rush you through so like tyranny that you don't have time to think about what you're reading. But the Bereans were wiser than those in Thessalonians. They did not believe St. Paul when he preached. They did not believe him only until they thoroughly vetted and compared what he said to Scripture and proved that what Paul was saying was true. You don't believe the Declaration of Independence unless it's proven to match up with the Bible. Otherwise, why are you believing it? Because you're a sucker. I was a sucker many times, and I'm sure I still will be a sucker. Because this is a game of battling deception, and no one wins perfectly. But if you don't win ultimately, where are you going to end up? So the show is, watch out for the leaven of Herod. See, theology is what moves everything. So we've been talking about Schofield. After the Civil War, Schofield comes in. He came in through Dabney, and I said in the last show that when Darby came, John Nelson Darby came from England, he was of the highest royalty. Nelson, his godfather, supposedly was Lord Nelson, the most popular British person, according to a recent poll, the most popular British person in the whole history of Britain. And he was a genius, always number one in his class. I mean, he just produced, he converted souls like crazy, and he produced writings, translations, everything. And he came in the middle of the Civil War, and now the people who created this revolution that were warned, and the South had pulled away from the false notions that led to the French Revolution that were in the American Revolution. The South had pulled away, but the North wins. And now something is not right. Why are you guys killing? If that was such a great experiment, if that was such a great thing forming this nation, why 70 years later are you all trying to kill each other for 4 years? The Battle of Antietam, 10,000 in one day. The whole American Revolution was only 6,000. So they sowed 6,000, and they ended up with 600,000 dead. And how many millions maimed? And how many people blown away in their head? The trauma. Well, in the middle of that war, Darby comes, plants his false notion, and they loved his false notion. What was Darby's false notion which Schofield popularized? That, number one, basically now, we're going to be Jewish. Okay, now why are the Christians Jewish today that follow so many, all the radio and TV preachers? Why are they Jewish? Because the essence of the Jewish faith is they're still waiting for the Messiah to come and defeat Satan, defeat evil, and they're still waiting for the Messiah to come and set up his kingdom, and for the Messiah to come and sit on the throne of David. Well, the current group of Christians in the last 70 years, the majority of them, are waiting for the same thing. They don't believe Satan has been bound yet, that Christ did not accomplish that on the first visit. We're still waiting for him to set up the kingdom. The vast majority of evangelical Christians believe that the kingdom never was set up on the first visit, first coming. And the promise that Gabriel gave to Mary that Jesus would be given the throne of David, that never happened. We're still waiting for it to happen. So we're in full agreement with the Jews on the basic fundamentals. So the Christians are Jews. So they call it the Judeo-Christian people. Well, I thought they were enemies. I thought the Jews said in the Talmud, Jesus is burning in excrement, and Mary was a whore, Jesus was a sorcerer, and the father of Jesus was a Roman soldier. How could you be united with these people? Well, because we both agreed that the Messiah has never bound Satan yet, the kingdom's never come, and we're both waiting for Christ to come and sit on the throne of David. So I guess we're in agreement. But the leaven of Herod is letting the government, Herod represented, he was the king, he was the political force, is allowing the political doctrines to overwhelm the church. And Jesus is saying, beware of the leaven of Herod. Don't let the teaching of Herod overwhelm you. Hold tight. And they held tight, and they were all martyred. Yeah, because that's what it takes. To hold tight against the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod required the apostles to die, because they could have saved their life by buying in to some of that teaching of the Pharisees and buying into some of the teaching of Herod, but they wouldn't, and so they were martyred. How are we doing today? Earnestly contend for the faith once delivered. So Schofield comes in, and it was a book, by all estimations, assisted by Jewish Zionists who helped publish it. Schofield had no means to do this, but they loved what he had in his footnotes. If you bless the Jews, you'll be blessed. If you curse the Jews, you'll be cursed. Satan's not bound. Jesus is not on the throne of David. I guess, well, we're in agreement with the Jews. This is what the Jews is. That's what they believe. And if Satan's not bound, if you look at it the other way, if Satan is bound and the kingdom is here and Jesus is on the throne of David ruling and bringing his enemies in submission under his feet, well, how is Jesus doing it? Through the Christians. The Christians are bringing all the enemies of Christ under their feet, taking the territory like Joshua and Caleb and ruling. Well, that's not going to happen if they believe Jesus is not bringing everything under his feet until finally he sits on the throne of David. But right now we're in retreat, and we're hoping to be rescued. You know, like World War II, Dunkirk. They retreated to Dunkirk and they got rescued. You know, we're hoping for the great rescue, the great rapture, to be rescued. But in the meantime, Satan is ruling, not Jesus. Well, this is what Darby brought. And it let them off the hook because they had to have felt extremely guilty facing a one of the highest preeminent British people that Britain had. They had to feel guilty for the American Revolution and the Civil War. And the proof of it is, in the middle of the Civil War, there developed a whole strong movement to amend the Constitution. These are Northerners, not Southerners. The Southerners had already amended their Constitution because when they seceded, they put God in it. They should have put Jesus Christ. They probably would have, if they had gone to that, they probably would have won. But they only put God. But the North said, we got to put Jesus Christ in the Constitution or God's wrath is going to take us out. And they said the war was a result of God's wrath on the country for not acknowledging Jesus Christ. Just like they said, the king, he's oppressing the British, the king George is oppressing us. He wants us to acknowledge his authority. Yeah, he does. And Jesus Christ wants us to acknowledge his authority and let him rule over us. And Jesus gave a parable. If you don't let the King Jesus rule over you, he will destroy you. And King George had the same, it says don't curse the king or don't curse the ruler of the people or God. And don't curse the ruler of the people. You have a duty to honor the king and honor God and obey the king. You have a duty. And we said no. He's trying to rule over us. Well, yeah. And your parents are trying to rule over you. And your husband's trying to rule over the wife. And the parents are trying to rule over the children. Yeah, they are. God commands them to. And it says that all governments instituted by God. And if you resist the governments, you resist God. You're disobeying God. Nobody wants to believe that in America. Why? Because we believe in the social contract. We are all independent. The temptation in the garden was, ye shall be as gods. The social contract gave that to us. We are gods. We created ourselves, basically. Dabney argues that. This is very atheistic. It eliminates God. Well, that's why the federal Constitution does not acknowledge God. It's all founded on the social contract. We're gods. And the only reason we form a social contract, that as gods we tend to fight each other. So we're going to get together and agree to set up our own government. We create government. We, the people, create this government, of the people, by the people, for the people. God is excluded. And until we repent and acknowledge Jesus Christ in our Constitution, as Dabney said, this thing is heading for destruction. And when you have a home where it's 50-50, not a real husband and a real wife doing their duties, keeping their vows, when you have 50-50, he said, the children reared will be nearer akin to devils than to men, and this is going to end up in anarchy and barbarism. And the only purpose we'll have as a nation is to be the scarecrow to the world. And when you see the three top leaders in this country, Biden, Pelosi, and Harris, and we're to speak, pray for them and not speak evil of them. But when the world sees those three, are they seeing that we are the scarecrow to the world? So this is Peter Helland on the show Israel.